The Honorable Peter Groff joins us here on Decision Makers. He is the former president of the Colorado State Senate, also a former Obama administration official, and a well-known expert, nationally known expert in education. He joins us now here on Decision Makers. Thanks for your time, Peter.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so a lot that's been happening on the political landscape these days. And I'd like for us to focus on governance, but how the politics of the day is influencing or impacting governance. Because, we've had these recent elections in places like Virginia, New Jersey, New York City, California, Maine. So, how does that shape the electorate's view of governance right now?
Well, I think there's, an issue in terms of when we kind of talk about governance, are we talking more about kind of the structural way things are done or leadership, right? Between transformative leaders, which we certainly hope that we have in place who aren't scared to do kind of big and bold things. Are we talking about kind of leadership of those who really kind of want to keep things on the status quo? Or are we talking more about the leadership of those who are kind of performance artists who just kind of want to get clicks, want to get on TV, want to get their name out there for a variety of different reasons? So I think depending on who we have in place, it's going to impact how the structure, how the institution gets things done. And so I think when you look at the elections that we had here recently, there weren't really surprises historically. That's what happens, particularly in Virginia. But with what's going on in DC, I think it really is going to have much more weight because it was really the first time the voters could say to the folks in DC, particularly at the White House, we do not like the way things are going. And so it was really the first opportunity they had to do that, and they put leaders in place who were vastly different than what we were seeing, certainly out of the White House.
Yeah, we did see that. A lot of these races, you can argue all of these races influenced by this anti-Trump sentiment or fervor. And I think the overlap is very interesting. I want to get your perspective on this, where there from the polling, right? You see these high disapproval rates for the current president, and so you have this rejection of the current administration through state races. So governor races, an attorney general race, right, in Virginia, which the attorney general, that doesn't have a whole lot to do. It has very little to do with a president, with a national president. So it was just really funny, very fascinating how you had this overlap. But I want to get your thoughts and perspectives on that as a former state elected official, state races influencing uh, what's happening at the federal level.
Will you not be shocked to hear that I think that state legislative races and state legislators um, in particular, the most powerful elected officials out there. But we can have that conversation later. But just to kind of push back on the attorney general piece, with the way that things are going with the Trump administration in terms of their constant violation of the rule of law, AGs, or those attorney generals, are going to be some of the most powerful elected officials that we have because they're going to be the ones that are going to have to push back and begin to take some of the things that the administration is doing to court and then put it on those judicial rails to hopefully get it to the Supreme Court
Right.
for potentially pushback or not. But the recent case with regard to the tariffs that was held recently, the hearing that was held recently, it
Mhm.
was one of those situations where the justices, the bulk of them said, we can't really give the president this much power, can we? As they were going back and forth with the attorneys. But it's going to be the attorney generals who are going to be the ones that are going to have to safeguard what states are doing, but then also push back on what the administration is doing in DC. So there is that piece in terms of what the attorney generals can do. Obviously, the governors that were elected last night are going to have a certain perspective in terms of how to get things done. From the left side of the aisle, they were bolstered, particularly in Virginia, by bigger legislative mandates on their side, as well as in states like Mississippi, where the supermajority was broke. So, on the Senate side. And so, I think you're going to see states really begin to push back on what they see from DC and begin to put things in place. And this is what the president has started. And so that's what the election last night was really about. We're not going to allow you to begin to pull all of this power together and have us not in some way say, no, that's not what we elected you to do.
What's been happening, I'm sure you can agree, what's been happening over the past, you know, 10 months or so, right? Over 10 months now, has pushed the broader public to think more deeply about government or the way they're being governed, in a way that we probably didn't think about before, or we took for granted, like you're just describing the AG, a state attorney general position, right? So the perception would be, oh, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with the federal
Right.
presidency or what's happening at the federal level, but it does, right? State legislature, state legislative races, or state level races have a whole lot to do with what's happening in Washington, or power that is conveyed by the or imposed by the president. So talk, if you can, a little bit about how government's been evolving over the, not just with Trump, but going back to the Biden administration, going back to Trump one, going back to Obama. I mean, what have you seen happening over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years, as far as the tone, the character of governance that we've been seeing?
Yeah, Charles, that's a great question because when I was in the legislature, pre-Obama, our conversations were not really generally around what Washington was doing. We were dealing specifically with Colorado issues, with Colorado in mind. But as we've seen the executive get more powerful and begin to delve into areas where generally state legislators had been dealing with, that the conversation about what you do as a state legislator has broadened. I just with President James Coleman in Colorado, we convened. I had this idea of bringing together, there are now a record number of legislative leaders of color. And so I thought we should bring them together and begin to have a conversation with them. President Coleman convened them in Denver in September. And the bulk of the conversations were around how do we impact X that's coming from Washington? How do we impact Y? Because the money that we had from that, based on grants that we had from Washington, has dried up. So a lot of those conversations were around how do we as legislative leaders deal with what's going on in Washington? And, I made the comment to President Coleman when I was sitting in his very chair, we didn't have those conversations, right? So very rarely was the conversation around policy in terms of what we wanted to put on the governor's desk was an answer to what was going on in Washington, or was a decision from the Supreme Court periodically, but generally that wasn't the case. And so, as you were suggesting with your question, the impact of what goes on in DC has now really greatly impacted what state legislators are doing and how they answer it.
Mm. Good governance, equitable governance. I should have asked this first, but now I want to pivot a little bit more from what you were talking about just now, as far as like how's everything been evolving. What direction should be taking? How should we define that? What's your definition or your working definition of it?
In terms of good governance,
Yeah, good governance.
yeah, again, I think I look at it from the public leadership standpoint in
Yeah.
terms of as a public leader, your job is to create policies or rules or regulations to ensure that the public good is taken care of and is kept. And so when you're able to create those boundaries for a governor, for a mayor, for a county commissioner, county executive, um, that in terms of good governance from a legislative standpoint, it's creating those arenas where those executives can ensure that the public good is is maintained, is secured, and then creating opportunities for folks who need them. So I think I look at it from kind of a legislative or a leadership standpoint as opposed to kind of an executive standpoint.
Now, we've talked in the past about equitable governance because you're also, and that implies that also forces a conversation on the diversity of the country we live in, diversity in different states, different regions, different cities, right? And so you have to construct a governance model that takes that reality in mind. And so, but we've had this complication, right? Particularly with the new administration coming in, the politics that we have in front of us, and now you've had the whole notion of equity scorned. And so how do we now, there was a time where we could openly talk about and try to construct that equitable governance model. We have to, but now with the way equity or conversation about equity has been pretty much once again has been scorned, and then also issues like redistricting, gerrymandering, being coming to light, and that being forced as well, forced into different diverse populations. How do we get there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think we're going to have really kind of two. John Edwards, I think it was when he was running for president, those couple of times kind of talked about two separate countries. I think we're going to have situations where in bluer states, there's going to be much more of a public sector that resembles the public that they are serving.
Okay.
That there are going to be many more opportunities, not only to learn about, but to incorporate the culture of all of the folks who make up whatever area it is that you represent as a state legislator. In I'm teaching a class now where we bring in um, generally elected officials or appointed officials to talk to master's level students at the University of Redlands in our Masters of Public Policy and Administration program. And just on Monday, we had Assemblyman James Ramos from California, from Southern California. And he talked about, as the only Native American in the General Assembly, how important it was for him to ensure that the culture of Native folks in California was going to be represented and made sure that it had some appearance in the budget matters. He's the chair of, they have different subcommittees for so many folks in California, so many and a lot of money to divide up, but he does justice and safety pieces. And so he wanted to ensure that kind of the culture was influencing that. Those are going to be the kind of conversations you're going to have in blue states. For red state legislators, they're going to have to fight through what's coming down from Washington to completely ignore history, to completely ignore diversity as if everyone is treated equally, which we know is not true. And we know the history and the influence of that really makes it difficult potentially for people of color to succeed and create opportunities. So they're going to have different fights to ensure that diversity and equity and inclusion reflects what they are seeing in those red states. And many of those red states are going to be states where people of color are the majority. And so they need to have some voice and some influence, and the culture of those folks needs to be seen in the laws that come out of those states. So they're going to have two different battles to do that. But hopefully, blue states will continue to lead the way. Again, this is where attorneys general can ensure that the federal government is kind of hands off in that area and that the blue state governors are allowed to do what they want to do, which is in most cases ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion is not only seen in state government, but those opportunities are there for the folks who they represent.
Yes, it's definitely something to continue to look at, especially as the whole, once again, that whole conversation around equity or the definition of equity, as we had been saying it for so long, being lampooned, being deconstructed. And so, yeah, definitely we're going to have to talk about and reflect on that more. So, are
And
you
just,
optim? Go
well, one
ahead.
thing, Charles, too, when we were in Rhode Island,
Mm-hmm.
I was on a panel that you were moderating in terms of education, and then that question of equity and where
Mm-hmm.
education was going. The Department of Education, where I was detailed when I was with the Obama administration, we were able to look at the numbers collected by states at the behest of the federal government to
Mm-hmm.
say what schools had a dropout issue or what schools are not performing well with Black or Latino girls or Black or Latino boys or whatever it might be. And we had all of these numbers where we could figure out and try and go out and find great programming that was working in whatever area for these students to help them achieve. Now we won't have that because, to your point, the Trump administration is tearing down those requirements, and so we're not going to really know how students are performing unless a state does that. So the state might be able to do it. Federal government's going to sue. Again, the attorney general is going to have to take that to court and say, we need to do this because we have X amount of students who look like this in this state, and we feel it's our responsibility in terms of the common good, not only for these students, but for these the neighborhoods in which they live in and the state as a whole. We have to ensure that we educate these kids properly. And so that's where, again, the AG as well as the state legislature to create policies to ensure that those opportunities are there.
Mm. Are you at all optimistic about where we're heading as far as governance is concerned, as far as government is concerned? We've got a federal government shutdown as we're talking right now. By the time this recording is finally published, the government shutdown could end. But right now, people not feeling optimistic that it will. But I want to get your thoughts on if this precipitous decline that we're in right now will head into the abyss and government will finally crack. I don't know how you feel about that.
You and I have known each other for a long time, and generally, I have been very optimistic about government battling kind of whatever demon from within we were facing. But I think this is a completely different situation. So optimistic, I don't know about optimistic, but I mean, I think obviously we catch some wind and some hope with the results from last night. We catch some wind and some hope from the 7 million folks who went out just a couple of weeks ago with the No Kings rally across the country. So, I mean, there is resistance out there, and that resistance is going to have to come from the public. And I think as the public begins to see what's going on in much more kind of clearer, stark reveals, then yeah, I think at some point we'll say, yeah, we can't do this, and they'll resist. But the question is, how much damage will be done between now and when people say, oh, wait a minute, this really is in play. And that's my concern is that time between now and when people say, oh, this is a massive problem, right? We have this existential threat. When they figure that out, how much damage is done? And then how can those folks who come behind fix that? And how will they be able to fix it? So um, there's some optimism, but I'm beginning to grow even more nervous each and every day as the level of urgency that I think we need to have, I just don't see it.
The government shutdown right now is breaking records. It's a result of near violent or seemingly violent partisan impasse. And so if you can describe, and I noticed you did this as a guest lecture one time for the Civic Literacy Media Influence Institute. I had you guest lecture in front of our fellows, and you had described um, those times when you could talk to legislators on the other side of the aisle. So talk about that. There was a bit of nostalgia in your voice, the way you described that. And it was kind of the ideal situation or the ideal scenario for how, hey, this is how legislators should deal with one another or collaborate.
Yeah, it was, I served between 2000 2009 in the legislature, almost 2010. And so that was kind of right before, it was right at the beginning, obviously, of the Obama administration, and I left to go there. But it was that time where I didn't see the other folks on the side as evil or them or those. We could go back and forth, and then we could sit down afterwards and hang out, have some Arnold Palmer, which is my favorite drink in the office, and just kind of sit and talk about our kids and sports and all of that, and really kind of got to know folks on the other side individually and as a human being. And it's so hard to hate somebody that you know, particularly when you're working with them in that kind of crucible of pressure for 120 days. And in leadership, you're there just about every day. And so I did not hate Josh Penry. I did not hate Scott John or any of the other folks who I served with, right? So, there was a guy by the name of Ted Harvey who is as right as you could be, but Ted and I had a great conversation. And so, it was really at a time where, I grew up, my father served for 20 years in the legislature, and he would talk about Republican members not in um, an existential threat type of way. He could be angry with them, he could dislike them, but never hated them. And so that's kind of how I grew up, and that's what I took into the body, right? And so I didn't hate the folks on the other side. I was trying to find a way to work with them. And even when I was in the majority, I knew I had the votes. So what harm is it to let Nancy Spence get up and talk? What harm is it to let um, Mark Hillman get up and talk because I knew I had the vote? So it wasn't about demeaning them. It wasn't about mocking them. It was about creating a better argument so that I could get 18 votes on a specific bill and send a bill out of the Senate. And so it was also the attempt to maybe work with them on stuff. I worked on a lot of education reform stuff. And Nancy and I and Keith King and other folks from the other side worked really well together on those issues. We know we didn't agree on criminal justice or healthcare, but I was with them and they were with me on education reform. And so it was more about trying to find that common that common link where we could really begin to kind of fasten that link and work on a specific issue to make the state better. If I didn't have them, then I could maybe go off to do work with somebody else. And so it was really about, I wouldn't say go as far as to say a family or anything like that, but it was really respecting the fact that they represented 130, 40,000 people just like I did. And we had different ideas. We came from different cultures, but the idea was to make Colorado better and to find a way to do that and to sit down with them and get to know them and get to know their spouses and get to know their backgrounds and just so that we could find some commonality sometime to move things along. But we didn't have social media. Social media was just beginning to kind of ratchet up as an influence. We didn't have, at the state level, obviously, we didn't have to worry about CNN and MSNBC generally coming around, just kind of local media. So we were able to work in a way that wasn't about us versus them, but us working together to make the state better.
Sounds really touching, right? And it sounds like it sounds like it was hundreds of years ago or decades
Seems like it.
ago.
Yeah.
It was kind of at the turn of the century in a sense, or shortly thereafter. But it was just right around the corner when you had those kinds of interactions that we clearly don't have that now. You and I have been talking recently, Peter, about media and some parting thoughts on the role that media should play in explaining to the public what good governance is. Because right now, when media reports on governance or how government is operating, like the way the government shutdown right now is unfolding, it's entertainment, but there's something much more serious there that the public should know, that the public should understand. What role should media be playing in this moment? The role that it's playing right now, what grade would you give it?
Well, I think that the issue with the media now, one is they have to deal with, for traditional media, they have to deal with social media and the influence of social media kind of basically on everything in our lives. And so they don't really have the time to do the kind of detailed
Mhm.
conversations and reporting because people are not going to watch that. They're going to have it in a 20 to 40-second clip on their phone. And that's really all they need to see to form all these opinions that they have. And so they're trying to figure out how to do this. And to your point, I think most of them are trying to, retain their viewers and get clicks on their social media platform. So it's not necessarily about, as you and I grew up, where there was three networks, right? There was this common sense of a common understanding or a common reality that they worked from. That's not the situation here. And so I think that that really has fueled this kind of crisis of knowing, where we have this anti-intellectualism that we don't trust experts. And so they don't have experts on, right? They have folks who are really good at some other field, pretending that they know politics and policy. Right, we have kind of this post-truth situation where there is no understanding of reality, even though that anchor knows what the person who's sitting next to them is saying is wrong, is fundamentally wrong. But it kind of in this post-truth situation, we're like, well, there's a different reality or a different truth or a different fact. And so we're really just dealing with those things, right? The inability of folks to kind of read beyond, as you say, what a ninth grade level. So how does the traditional media put stuff out there? They generally don't. They generally don't. They generally kind of move away from anything serious as quickly as they possibly can to figure out why Tom Brady spent $50,000 to clone his dog, or why some soccer star was knighted, or why. I mean, those are the things that we're seeing on news channels. Or if you maybe even go to kind of some of the online stuff, um, like Roland Martin show, which I watch just about every day. He basically mocks the right, calls them names, has people on who absolutely agree with him, and if they don't agree with him, we don't see them anymore. So we're not getting any news or any information, even at those folks who have kind of this really unique opportunity to do that. And so they need to try and figure out, or they need to just maybe just say, we're going to present the news and we're going to allow it to kind of sit with folks, and whether they believe us or not, or whether they turn off or not, is not going to be our concern. So we'll see how that happens. But I always have on all three channels right now, or the three big news channels, and they're all talking about different things with people who generally are not experts in the area,
Right, right.
right? But they're good talkers, right? So, the cable news are going to have on good talkers. Those online shows are going to have on good talkers. And you worked in this industry. And so, I mean, you worked again at a time where it was about getting information out to folks and then letting folks make the decision.
Right.
That's not where they are now. I think they need to get back to that and just kind of give straight news and allow people to make their decision.
Yeah, we're in the age where sports broadcasters I've heard are now doing electoral forecasts. So I've heard. So
Yeah. One in particular who's going to scream at you and say he
right.
wants to be president. But
Yeah,
this is where we are, right? So this is where we are that someone from ESPN,
right.
who is paid to literally talk about sports and generally doesn't even really watch it apparently,
Mm-mm.
then decides, well, maybe I can do this other thing. And
Right.
so he's doing the other thing, not qualified to do it. But
Right.
again, this is where we are. I think, we have this kind of tsunami of incompetence in this country, and it's just kind of washing over everybody. You don't have to be an expert. You don't really have to even know kind of basic tools here or there. I mean, we have radio talk show hosts who do the same thing, who presidential candidates go on this show, and talk to people who literally have no idea what they're talking about, other than their voters,
Mm.
presumably. Right. And so this is kind of where we are. And at some point, I don't know who that person is, but someone in the media, has to say we have to do better. There's very few places where you can go. Um, I don't know, maybe that PBS NewsHour, and who knows how long they'll be around.
Right.
BBC, Financial Times, in terms of reading stuff. So, a lot of it's going to be foreign influence who don't really have to deal with the dog and pony show of American news media.
Yeah. Well, we will see how it turns out or how it transpires over time. So, thanks again, Peter. Really appreciate your time as always. That's it for this segment. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer and host. So, we want to give a round of gratitude as always to our partners, the Council of State Governments, especially the Eastern region of that, and the Civic Literacy and Media Influence Institute at Learn for Life. Always thanking them for their support. Also, Diane Ellison is executive producer. Raven Robinson is senior producer. And until then, you can find this episode and more episodes of Decision Makers while you're subscribing, of course, at thebnote.com. Thanks for watching.